Hi guys, welcome back to Tori's Stories. I'm sorry I've been out for a few days. Really, it's been almost a week. I was out with strep throat and I could not talk. So, we'll get back to where we were. We're on chapter 4 of Serafina and the Black Cloak. Serafina rushed up to her father in the workshop and grabbed his arm, trying to talk and catch her breath at the same time. She gasped, "Pa, there's a missing girl, just like I said." And Mr. Vanderbilt searching the whole house. Her words tumbled out with a mixture of urgency and pride as she hurriedly reminded him of what she'd seen the night before. She was sure that he'd seen now that she wasn't dreaming or making up stories. "They're searching the house?" he asked, ignoring everything else. He turned quickly, gathered up his cooking supplies and a razor from the bench, and he dragged her mattress into the hidden area he'd constructed behind the tool rack. There could be no evidence of their living there when the search party came through. "What about the girl I saw disappear?" she asked, in confusion. She couldn't figure out why he wasn't interested in what she was telling him. "Children don't just disappear, Sarah," he said as he continued his efforts. Her heart sank. He still didn't believe her. Her pa looked around the room one last time to make sure he hadn't missed anything, and then he looked at her. For a moment, she thought he was finally going to listen to what she was saying, but then he pointed at her hairbrush and snapped, "For God's sakes, girl, pick up your things." "But what about the man in the black cloak?" she argued. I don't want you thinking about anything like that," he barked. "It was nothing but a nightmare. Now hush up." She flinched from the words. She couldn't understand why he was being so mean, but she could hear the worry in his voice, along with the anger and the distance. She could hear the search party coming down the stairs. She knew it wasn't just a threat of discovery that scared him. He hated any talk of the supernatural or any sort of dark, fiendish sources out in the world that he couldn't fix with his wrenches and hammers and screwdrivers. "But it's real," she demanded. "The girl's actually gone, Pa. I'm telling the truth. A little girl's gotten herself lost. That's it. And they're looking for her, so they'll find her wherever she is. Get your wits about you. People don't just vanish. She's got to be someplace." She stood in the center of the room. "I think we should both go out there now and tell them everything I saw," she declared boldly. "No, Sarah," he said. "They'll spit nails if they find me living down here. They'll fire me. Don't you understand that? And God knows that they'll make fun of you. They don't even know you're alive, and we're going to keep it that way. I'm talking to you dead straight now, girl. You hear me?" The sound of the search party could be heard down the corridor, and it was coming their way. Clenching her teeth, she shook her head in frustration and stood before him. "Why, Pa? Why? Why can't people see me?" She didn't have the courage to tell him that at least one Vanderbilt already had, and that he knew her name. "Just tell me, Pa, whatever it is. I'm 12 years old now. I'm grown up. I deserve to know." "Look, Sarah," he said, "last night somebody sabotaged the dynamo. Did some real damage. I'm not sure I can mend. If I don't get it fixed by nightfall, there's going to be hell to pay from the boss, and rightly so. The lights, the elevators, the servant call system, the whole place depends on Edison machine." She tried to imagine someone sneaking into the electrical room and damaging the equipment. "But why would someone do that, Pa?" The search party was making its way through the kitchens, and it would arrive in the workshop at any moment. "I ain't got time to think about it," he said, moving towards her with his huge body. "I just gotta get it working, that's all. Now, do you hear what I tell you?" He charged around the room and hid things with such roughness and loudness and violence, and it frightened her. She crept behind the boiler and watched him. She knew that when he was like this, she couldn't get anywhere with him. He just wanted to be left alone and do his job and his work on his machines. But it was gnawing at her. The more she thought about it, the madder she got. She knew it wasn't the right time to talk to him about everything she'd been thinking and feeling. But she didn't care. She just blurted it out. "I'm sorry, Pa," she said. "I know you're busy, but please just tell me why you don't want anyone to see me." She stepped out from behind the boiler to face him, her voice getting louder now. "Why have you been hiding me all these years?" she demanded. "Just tell me what's wrong with me. I want to know. Why are you ashamed of me?" By the time she was done, she was practically screaming at him. Her voice was so loud the shrills actually echoed. Her pa stopped dead in his tracks and looked at her. She knew she had finally reached down inside him and grabbed the armored heart of his. She finally stirred him up. She felt a sudden impulse to take it all back and dart behind the boiler again and hide, but she didn't. She stood before him and looked at him as steadily as she could with her eyes watering. He stood very still over by the bench. His huge hands balled up into fists. A visible wave of pain and despair seemed to pass through him all at once, and for a moment he couldn't speak. "I am not ashamed of you," he said gruffly, his voice strangely hoarse. The searchers were now only one room away. "You are," she shot back. She was trembling in fear, but she wasn't going to give up this time. She wanted to shake him. She wanted to shake him to the core. "You're ashamed of me," she said again. He turned away from her. She couldn't see his face, just the back of his head, a huge, bulky body. Several seconds of silence went by. Then he shook his head like he was arguing with himself or furious with her or both. She wasn't sure. "Just keep your mouth shut and follow me," he said, as he turned and walked out of the room. Scurrying after him, she caught up with him in the corridor. Her body felt queasy all over. She didn't know where he was taking her or what was going to happen. She could barely suck in breaths. He led her down a narrow stone stairs to the sub-basement and into the electrical room with the iron dynamo, thick black wires, and spidered up the wall. They left the search party behind them, at least for a while. "We'll hole up in here," he said, as he pulled the door shut with a heavy thud and locked them in. As he lit his lantern against the darkness, she never seen him look so serious, so grave, and so pale, and it frightened her. "What's happening, Pa?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Sit down," he said. You ain't gonna act like what I gotta tell you. You ain't gonna like what I gotta tell you, but it might help you understand." Serafina swallowed, sat down on the old wooden stool of copper wire, and prepared herself to listen. Her pa sat on the floor facing her, with his back against the wall, staring down at the floor, deep in thought, and he began to talk. "Years ago, I was working as a mechanic in the train yard in Asheville," he said. "The foreman and his wife had just had their third baby boy, and their home was full of joy. But while everyone else celebrated, I sat alone in kind of self-made misery. I ain't proud of it, the way I was snooping around that night, but things weren't working out for me the way that they were supposed to in a man's life. I wanted to meet a good woman, build a house in town, and have children of my own, but years had gone by, and that hadn't happened. I was a big man and not much to look at. I sweated all day on the engines, and those few times I encountered women folk, I could never find words. I could talk about nuts and bolts till morning come, but not much else." She opened her mouth to ask a question, but she didn't want to disrupt the story that was finally pouring out of her paw. "That night, while everyone was tipping the jug," he continued, "I was feeling pretty poor, and I headed out. I went for a long walk, just walking like you do when you got too much on your mind and to do naught else. I went deep into the forest and up through River's Gap and into the mountains. When night came, I kept walking." It was hard for her to picture her father traveling through the forest. All those times he had warned her had led her to believe that he would never set foot into the forest. He hated the forest. At least he did now. Why are you scared, Pa? Nah, I weren't, he said, shaking his head and still looking at the floor. But I should have been. Why? What happened? She couldn't even imagine what it was. The flicker of the lantern cast an eerie shadow on his face. She had always loved his stories, but this one felt closer to heart than any story he had ever told. As I was walking through the woods, I heard a queer howling noise, like an animal in a terrible, writhing pain. The bushes were moving something fierce, but I couldn't quite make out what it was. Was it something dying, Pa? She leaned towards him. I don't think so, he said, looking up at her. The ruckus in the bushes went on for a spell, and the noises stopped all of a sudden like. I thought it was over, but then a pair of greenish-yellow eyes peered out from the darkness. Whatever sort of man or beast it was, it circled around me, taking one position and then another, studying me real careful, like it was trying to make a decision about whether I was worth eating. Or just letting be. I sensed a real power behind those eyes, but then the eyes disappeared. The beast was gone, and I heard a strange mewling, crying sound. I straightened her back and looked at him. Crying. He asked in confusion. That definitely wasn't what she was expecting. I searched through the bushes. Blood covered the ground, and a body lay in a pile of small creatures. 3 of them were dead. 1 of them remained barely alive. She got off the wooden spool and crouched down beside her Pa. She stared at him, totally absorbed in his story. In her mind, she could see the bloody creatures on the ground. But what kind of creatures were they? She asked in amazement. He shook his head. Like everyone else who lived in these mountains, I heard the stories of black magic, but I never gave them much credit until that night. I studied. Excuse me. I studied the one that was still alive the best I could in the darkness, but I couldn't figure out what kind of thing it was. Or, more likely, my mind just couldn't believe it. But when I finally took up the creature in my bare hands and held it, I realized that it was actually a tiny human baby curled into a little ball. Serafina opened up her eyes wide in surprise. Wait, what? I don't understand. What happened? How did a baby get there? The same question was running through my own mind, believe me. But one thing I knew for certain, regardless of how she came into the world, I had to get this baby some help. I bundled her up in my jacket and hiked back down the hill and carried her out of the woods. I took her to the midwives, and the covenant and begged them to help, but they gasped at the sight of her, muttering that she was the devil's work. They said she was malformed, near death, and there was nothing they could do to help her. But why? Serafina cried out in outrage. That's terrible. That's so mean. Just because something looked different, they just wanted to throw it away? She couldn't help but wonder what kind of world it was out there. The attitude of midwives almost bothered her more than the idea of a yellowed-eyed beast lurking in the night. But she felt the renewed glimmer of admiration for her Pa, and she imagined his huge warm hands wrapped around the tiny little baby, giving it a heart, keeping it alive. Her father took a deep, troubled breath as he remembered of that night, and he continued his story. You have to understand, the poor little thing had been born with her eyes closed, Sarah, and the nun said that she would never see. She'd been born deaf, and that she would never hear, and it was plain enough to see that she had 4 toes on each foot instead of 5, but there was the least of it. Her collarbones were malformed, and she had an unnaturally long curving spine, all twisted like, and she did not look like she could survive. The shock hit her like a blow. She looked up at her father in astonishment. I'm the baby? She shouted, leaping to her feet. This wasn't just a story. This was her story. She had been born in the forest. This meant her Pa found her and taken her in. She was like a little baby fox who had been raised by a coyote. She stood in front of her Pa. I'm the baby, she said again. Her father looked at her, and she saw the truth flickering in his eyes, but he didn't acknowledge it. He didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. It was like he couldn't reconcile with his memory of that dark night with the daughter that he had now, and that he had to tell the story the only way he could, as if it wasn't her at all. The bones of the baby's back were connected to each other and the way they should have been, he continued. The nuns were half scared out of their wits with the idea of caring for this child like it was some sort of demon spawn, but to me it was a little baby, a little chatelaine, and you didn't abandon such a thing. Who cares how many toes she had? Serafina kneeled on the floor in front of him, trying to understand it all. She was beginning to see the kind of man her father was, and maybe where she had got some of her own stick-to-the-iveness. But it was also confusing. How could she get anything from him if she wasn't even his? I took that baby away, fearing them nuns would draw on her, he said. I hate them nuns, she spat. They're terrible. He shook his head, not in disagreement, but more like the nuns didn't mean anything at all because they were the least of his problems. I didn't have the proper food, he said, so I crept into the farmer's barn and milked a goat and stole a bottle or two. Felt ashamed doing these things, but I needed to get some food into her, and I couldn't see a better road. That night I fed the little chatelaine her first meal, and as bad off as she was, with her eyes closed, she drank it down real good, and I remember praying that somehow it'd help. The more I held her and watched her suck down the milk, the more I wanted her to live. Then what happened? She slid closer to him. She knew that outside the locked door was the electrical room. Somewhere above them, the lawful habitations of the Biltmore estate. The Biltmore estate were searching room to room, but she didn't care. Keep going, Pa, she nudged. I looked for a woman who could mother the baby proper, but none of them would do it, and they sure she was gonna die. But 2 weeks later, while I was fixing an engine with one hand and bottle feeding the chatelaine with the other, something happened. She opened her eyes for the first time, and she stared straight at me. All I could do was stare right back at her. She had these big, beautiful yellow eyes that just didn't stop. I knew then that I was hers and she was mine, and that we were kin now, and there was no denying it. Serafina was so mesmerized by the story that she barely blinked. The yellow eyes that her father spoke of were still looking at him, and had been for 12 years. He rubbed his mouth slowly with his hands, looking over at the dynamo, and then he continued the story. In the time that followed, I fed the little chatelaine every morning and every night. I slept with her tucked under my arm, and I nestled her in an open toolbox beside me when I worked, and she started growing up a little. I taught her how to crawl and run about. I was trying my best to take good care of her. She was mine now, you see, but people started asking questions, and the government types started coming around, men with badges and guns. One night when I was working on the train yard, 3 of them waited for me and warned off a bit, but then they cornered her, trapped her in real tight. They were going to take her away and put her in some place, God knows where, or maybe somewhere worse. I hit the first officer so hard that he went down bleeding, and I didn't get up. And then I struck the second one and grabbed for the third, and he skedaddled out of there. The little chatelaine was all right, thank God, but I knew we were in trouble. They'd be coming back with more men next time, chains for me and cage for the chatelaine. I knew then that we had to go. We had to escape the praying eyes and yammering mouths in the city, so I quit the train yard and found a new job way up in the mountains working construction of a great house. She gasped. She realized he hadn't been hiding her. He'd been hiding them. That's why we're in the basement, she thought. With a wave of relief passed through her. He was protecting her. I took her through good times and bad, her pa continued, just doing everything I could over the years. Strange, a little creature I found in the forest grew up into a fine little girl, and I did my best to forget how she came into the world and how I got her. And finally, her father paused. He looked at her in the ear nest. And that's you now, Sarah, he said. That's you. It's plain to see that you're not the other girl. But you're not mishappen or hideous like them nuns said you'd be. You're remarkably graceful in your movements, fast and agile like I've never seen. You're not deaf, and blind, like they said, but you're real sharp in your senses. I've been protecting you every day for the last 12 years, and that's God's truth. They've been the best 12 years of my life. You mean the world to me, girl, and there's no shame here, none at all. Just a strong desire to keep us both alive. When he stopped and looked at her with his steady, dark eyes, she realized that she'd been sobbing and quickly wiped the tears off her face and before he got mad at her for crying. In some ways, she felt she felt closer to her pa in that moment, for his story had snagged her heart. But there was something else rolling up inside of her, too. Her father wasn't her father. He found her in the woods and had taken her. He'd been lying to her and everyone else her entire life. All these years, he'd refused to talk about her mother, just let her wonder on, and now here he was. The truth. Tears kept streaming down her face. She felt so stupid imagining fancy ladies and her mother, forgetting about the washing machine and all that stuff she used to think about when she was little. She spent countless hours wondering where she came from, and he had known all this time. Why didn't he tell me? She asked him. He didn't answer her. Why didn't you tell me, Pa? She asked again. Staring at the ground, he shook his head slowly back and forth. Pa, finally he said, because I didn't want it to be true. She stopped and looked at him in shock. But it is true, Pa. You can't just wish things aren't true and then they are true. I'm sorry, Sarah, he said. I just wanted you to be my little girl. She was angry, very angry, but she felt a lump in her throat. She had finally reached deep down into his heart and told her what he was thinking. And she was feeling what he was frightened of and what he dreamed of. And what he dreamed of was her. She clenched her teeth and breathed through her nose and looked at him. I was angry and confused and amazed and excited and frightened all at the same time. She finally knew the truth, at least some of it. Now she knew that she didn't have to feel different. She was different. The thought of it terrified her, that she was a creature of the night. She came from the very forest that her pa told her to fear all her life and had forbidden her to enter. The thought of coming from a place repulsed her, scared her, but at the same time was strange confirmation in it, almost a relief. It made a twisted kind of sense to her. She looked at her father, sitting with his back against the wall. Now that he finally told her the story, he seemed exhausted, like a man who had shared a great burden. He picked himself up off the floor, brushed his hands off, and walked slowly to the other side of the room, deep in thought. I'm sorry, Sarah, he said. I reckon I ain't gonna do you no good on the inside knowing all that, but you're right. You're growing up now, and you deserve to know. He came over to her and squatted down and held her so that he could look into her face. But whatever you do with it, I want you to remember one thing. There's nothing wrong with you, Sarah. Nothing at all. Do you hear? Yeah, I hear, Pa, she said, nodding and wiping her tears from her eyes. There was turmoil in her heart, but the thing she knew for sure was her father believed her. But as if she stood there looking at him, thoughts and questions started weaving through her mind. Would she have been hidden forever? Could she ever fit in with the people in Biltmore? Could she ever make friends? She was a creature of the night, but what did that mean she could do? She looked down at her hands, and she grew out her fingernails. They would become claws? In the distance, she could hear the sound of a search party moving through the basement, and she tried to block it out. She looked over at her father again. After a long pause, she quietly asked the question that had been forming in her mind. What about my mother? Her pa shut his eyes for a second and took a good long breath and then opened his eyes, looked at her, and spoke to her with unusual softness. I'm sorry, Sarah. The truth is, I don't rightly know. But when I see her in my mind, I think she must have been beautiful, both lovely and strong. She fought hard to bring you into this world, Sarah, and she wanted to stay with you, but she couldn't. I don't know why she couldn't, but she gave you to me to love and take care of, and for that, I'm much obliged. So maybe she's still out there someplace. Her voice trembled uncertain. Her pa's story had made it feel like there was a tornado twisting inside of her, but the thought of her mama felt like it was bursting of the sun. Maybe she is. He relented gently. She looked at him. Pa, do you think that... Do you know if she was human or... I don't want to talk about that, he interrupted her, shaking his head. He could see the tightness she could see the tightness in his mouth, how upset her question made him. You're my little girl, he said, and that's what I believe. But in the forest, she began. No, he cut her off. I don't want you to think about that. You live here with me. This is your home. I told you before, and I'll tell you again, Sarah. Our world is filled with many mysteries, things that we don't understand. Never go into deep parts of the forest, for there are dangers there, both dark and bright, and they will ensnare your soul. She stared at her pa for a long time, trying to comprehend his words. She could see seriousness in his eyes, and she felt it too, deep down in her heart. Her pa was the only person she'd ever had in the world. She heard men coming from down the corridor outside the door. They were searching the rooms of the sub-basement. The hair in her arms tingled, telling her to run. She looked at her pa. After all he'd done for her by telling her this story, she didn't want to bring it up again, didn't want to make him angry, but she had to ask one last question. What about the man who took the girl in the yellow dress? What kind of demon is he, Pa? Does he come from out in the forest, or do you think he's one of the fancy yellow dress swells from upstairs? I don't know, he said. I've been praying to God in heaven that it was a figment of your imagination. It wasn't, Pa, she said softly. I didn't want to argue with her anymore, but he looked straight at her. Don't get it into your head that you're going to go out there, Sarah, he said. It's just too dangerous for us. You see why now. I know you're hankering to help her, and that does you credit, but don't worry about that girl. She's their kin, not ours. They don't need our help. They'll find her. You stay out of it. At that moment, someone pounded on the heavy wooden door in the electrical room. We're searching the house, a man shouted. Serafina glanced around, even though she already knew that there was no way out of the room. Open this door, a man shouted. Open up. Alright, I will see you guys again tomorrow for Chapter 5 of Serafina and the Black Cloak.